Today's webinar is essentially the first episode of the first season on the Medicrew Masterclasses. And these classes have been arranged in a manner so that they are easily browsable, and you also get to repeatedly watch this through our YouTube channels. We have handpicked a few important topics from cardiovascular system that comprises the season one. And as usual in these webinars, we will try to integrate the basic sciences with the clinical disciplines. Today, we start in the first episode with the most basic aspect of cardiovascular system, the properties of cardiac muscle. And as you know that understanding the properties of cardiac muscle is the key minimum thing that you should know to understand clinical interpretation of cardiac failure, ischemic heart disease, of arrhythmias, and also exploring the ECG stream, which we shall be gradually covering through the rest of the seasons. So please be interactive, and uh, you can type Y for yes, N for no, and type in any question and answer that you'd like to present to us. So here we start. Please let me know if the screen is visible to all by typing yes. Thank you. So the way we have arranged the webinar is that today's episode is divided into three parts, and these three parts are the functional anatomy of the cardiac tissue, followed by the mechanical properties of heart, and then the electrophysiological properties of heart. Now, at the beginning of every section, I will present to you five interactive MCQs. And I would like all of you to participate. It doesn't matter if it is right or wrong. You try to answer the questions by simply typing the option. At the end of that MCQ session, we'll start discussion on the relevant portion, and we'll again get back to the same MCQs and see if our answers have changed. So here we start with the first section of properties of cardiac muscle, the functional anatomy of heart and cardiac tissue. So this is your first question. Simply type A, B, C, or D to represent your answer. Compared to the contractile myocardial cells, junctional tissues like Purkinje fibers have A, more mitochondria, B, more striation, C, greater conduction velocity, and D, all of the above. Please type in your answers. So I see that the answers are split between C and D, with more people going for D. The next question. AC node and AV node are supplied by. Now, read the questions carefully because the order matters. A, left vagus and right vagus respectively. B, right vagus and left vagus respectively. C, right vagus only. And D, left vagus only. Thank you for the response. We'll move on to the third question. False about sympathetic supply of heart is. So you have to find the false statement. Most fibers originate in stellate ganglia. Fibers secrete noradrenaline. Fibers secrete neuropeptide Y. They supply endocardial part of the heart. It's great to see so many responses coming in. Question number 4. Look at the picture very carefully. This is a hematoxylin eosin stained section of the cardiac muscle. And you can see the intercalated discs are labeled. So my question is, intercalated discs contain A. Fascia adherens, B. desmosome, C. Gap junction, and D. all of the above. Here again, the answers are split between B, C, and D, as I can see. Let's move on to the final question of the section before we start the discussion. Question number 5. This is a statement that I present to you. Cardiac muscle contains more abundant connective tissue than skeletal muscle. Is the statement true or false? Wonderful. So let us start the discussion on the section 1 of this episode, that is the functional anatomy of the cardiovascular system. Now we all know that heart has 4 chambers, and these 4 chambers along with the vasculature forms 2 very prominent circuitry in the body, the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation. Now, if you go into the structure of the cardiac muscle, there are a few peculiarities in the structure of the cardiac muscle. The cardiac muscle is striated like the skeletal muscle. This is simply because the actin and myosin are organized in a systematic fashion. In any muscle where actin and myosin are organized systematically, they will be striated. Smooth muscles also contain actin and myosin, but they are haphazardly arranged. So under the microscope, we don't see a pattern. Now, one unique feature of the cardiac tissue is that, as you can see, they are all connected to each other, both mechanically as well as electrically. Mechanically, you can see they all behave like parallel branchings of a single muscle tissue. The reason why this is also called a syncytium. The intercalated disc that you can see in the schematic diagram as well as in the stained section are the areas of impulse transmission and also stress management. These intercalated discs are not only electrical junctions but also mechanical junctions. They contain the desmosomes and fascia adherens for their mechanical strength so that they don't rupture and separate. And they contain gap junctions so that the current can uninterruptedly flow from one cell to another. And this makes the heart not only a functional syncytium but also a structural syncytium. It would not be wrong to say that the cardiac tissue is composed of 2 muscles, the atrial syncytium, that is the interconnected atrial mass, and the ventricular syncytium, that is the interconnected ventricular mass. So these 2 muscles essentially make the heart, and they are separated by a fibrous ring. If you see the nerve supply of the cardiovascular system, you will see that embryologically, the SA node develops on the left side of the heart and the AV node on the right side of the heart. Then due to rotation of the structures, both ultimately end up in the right atrium. But developmentally, SA node is a left-sided structure, a right-sided structure, and AV node is a left-sided structure. Because SA node is a right-sided structure, it is supplied by the right-sided nerves. So it is supplied by the right vagus, and also most of the sympathetic fibers that it receives are from the right stellate ganglion. Similarly, the AV node being developmentally a left-sided structure, it is supplied by the left vagus nerve and also by most of the fibers of the sympathetic chain on the left side, also coming mostly from the stellate ganglion. Now, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves have a unique way of supplying the heart. So, it's very interesting to see that suppose this is a parasympathetic fiber that is terminating on the cardiac tissue, releasing acetylcholine. And let us assume that this is a sympathetic fiber terminating on the heart, supplying noradrenaline. Now, interestingly, the parasympathetic fiber, which secretes acetylcholine, also has a few branch offs. And these branches interact with the sympathetic nerve presynaptically, that is, even before they have started secretion. Here also it secretes acetylcholine and it has a form of a reciprocal inhibition. It inhibits the release of noradrenaline from the sympathetic nerve fibers. So acetylcholine will act both synaptically as well as presynaptically. The noradrenergic fibers show a unique phenomenon of co-transmission. They release noradrenaline on the heart, which will act on the beta-1 adrenergic receptor. But similar to the cholinergic fibers, they also show the phenomenon of reciprocal innervation. So they will also presynaptically innervate the cholinergic fiber, but here it releases neuropeptide Y, which causes a presynaptic inhibition of the cholinergic fiber. So apart from a central regulation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic activity by the hypothalamus and other parts of the brain, there is also a local moderation that occurs at the level of the heart. Also, the depth to which the nerve fibers supply vary. The cholinergic fibers typically supply up to the endocardial surface, that is the inner surface. Whereas the noradrenergic fibers typically supply the epicardial surface. They never go deep into the endocardium. Although there are interconnections and interneurons, but the direct nerve ending never goes to the endocardium. It ends over the epicardial surface. So these are few of the peculiarities of the autonomic nerve supply of the heart. I hope this is clear to everyone. Great. Now, as I was saying that the whole of the atrium behaves as a single syncytium and the whole of the ventricle behaves as a single syncytium. They are not functionally connected to each other. So impulse from atrium cannot directly go to the ventricle. The only connection between the atrium and the ventricle is the bundle of His. So if the penetrating portion of the bundle of His gets severed or degenerates due to any kind of problem, there will be an atrioventricular dissociation. This dissociation can be an anatomical disruption. It can also be a functional disruption that happens in complete heart block due to degenerative diseases. The junctional tissues that we can see here, these junctional tissues are very unique. One thing that you can see here clearly is that they are pale tissues. They look more like nerve fibers than like muscle. As a result of this, we have seen histologically that the junctional tissues have less striation. They have less mitochondria because they don't have to contract that much. However, their conduction velocity is very fast, mimicking the activity of nerve action potential. So the only thing that differentiates these junctional tissues from the working myocardial cells is a faster conduction velocity. Mitochondrial content is definitely low, and also the striations are effectively low in junctional tissues of heart. It's also very interesting to see that different parts of the junctional tissue can have other peculiarities. For example, as we shall also see later, the AV node is a seat of high resistance where the impulse will wait for a nodal delay. The reason why AV node has high resistance, although being a very solid structure, means the cross-sectional diameter will be more, assuming that the conduction velocity should have been faster. But still it is not so because the cells contain less number of gap junctions. It is the paucity of the gap junction that make AV node a highly electrically resistant structure, making the impulse wait for some time before the ventricular filling has completed. So let us try the questions that we started with and see if we can answer them correctly now. We start with question number 1 again. Compared to contractile myocardial cell, junctional tissues like Purkinje fibers have. What is the right answer now? Wonderful. So undoubtedly the answer is C, greater conduction velocity. Option A and B are wrong. Second question. SA node and AV node are supplied by. Very good. The answer is B, right vagus and left vagus respectively. Third question. False about sympathetic supply of heart is. Very good. The answer is D, that they supply endocardial part of the heart. This is wrong. They only supply up to the epicardial part of the heart. Question number 4. Intercalated discs contain. Great. The answer is D, all of the above. So coming to question number 5, is this statement true or false? Now I did not discuss this, so I will now discuss this. Cardiac muscle actually contains more abundant connective tissue. This excess amount of connective tissue in heart compared to skeletal muscle performs a few important functions. It is because of this dense connective tissue network that heart is resistant to rupture. Imagine this is the only structure that has started beating before birth and will beat till death. So there is every chance that it can get mechanically injured or rupture. The connective tissue also prevents overstretching of the heart, physiologically preventing dilation. So when these tissues become degenerated or loose, other kinds of cardiomyopathies can occur. So this was the functional anatomy of the cardiac muscle. And now we move on to the next section, the mechanical properties of heart. Before we start, we have 5 MCQ questions for you. This is your first question. Contractility of the heart depends on A, preload, B, afterload, C, autonomic innervation, and D, all of the above. Next question. Excitation-contraction coupling in cardiac muscle is dash in nature. Fill up the gap. Is it electrochemical, electromechanical, electrical, or chemical? Next question. Look at this graph very carefully. It is a graph of stroke volume versus afterload. In this graph, there are 3 curves, A, B, and C. Which curve shows maximum contractility? Choose between A, B, C, and D, which is they have equal contractility. So I can see that the answers are split between almost all the options. We'll move on to a similar question, which is our question number 9. Study this graph carefully. This is a preload versus stroke volume curve, also known as the Frank-Starling curve. Out of these three trajectories, A, B, and C, which one represents maximum contractility? Fine. Finally, we come to the 10th question, after which we start our discussion. Read the question carefully. We are talking about a newly discovered drug, X. It is found to stimulate phosphodiesterase enzyme in the cardiac cells. What will be the probable effect of the drug? Will it be positive inotropic agent, negative inotropic agent, or have no effect on the inotropic state? Great. So we are done with the questions. Now we enter into the discussion on mechanical properties of heart. And then we'll come back to these questions to check our answers. Now, by mechanical properties, we mean properties that involve the transmission of force or performance of work. Excitation-contraction coupling simply means when you excite a tissue and then it starts to contract. So the electrical energy is now converted into a mechanical energy. How that happens is known as the coupling or excitation-contraction coupling. Skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle have almost similar structures. So the overall mechanism of muscle contraction is more or less same. But the excitation-contraction coupling is slightly different in the cardiac muscle compared to that of the skeletal muscle. So let us see how the excitation-contraction coupling happens in cardiac tissue. So the impulse, which is the action potential, reaches the sarcolemma, that is the cell membrane. As the impulse reaches the sarcolemma, the action potential spreads down the T tubule. As the action potential spreads down the T tubule, you can see it acts on a particular receptor or channel. This receptor or channel is known as the dihydropyridine receptor. Just a minute, please. This is known as the dihydropyridine receptor. It is the dihydropyridine receptor which is different in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. That is the only difference. So the current moves through the T tubule, reaches the DHP receptor. In cardiac muscle, the DHP receptor is actually a calcium channel. So what it causes is, it causes influx of calcium in the form of electrical spark. So there is entry of calcium ion in sparks. And this spark of calcium stimulates another calcium channel, which is known as ryanodine receptor, present on the sarcoplasmic reticulum or endoplasmic reticulum. So the calcium stimulates the ryanodine receptor in sarcoplasmic reticulum. Once this is stimulated, more calcium comes out from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, because you know endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria and nucleus, these three are the storehouses of calcium. So more calcium come out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And this calcium will now cause muscle contraction. So how is this different in the skeletal muscle? In the skeletal muscle, the DHP receptor, as I told you, is slightly different. So what is the difference? The DHP receptor does not act as a calcium channel. Instead, the ryanodine receptor is closed by a valve. And this valve is mechanically connected to the DHP receptor by a fiber-like structure. So in skeletal muscle, when the DHP receptor is stimulated, this fiber contracts like a spring and the valve opens and more calcium comes out. So in both cases, you can see it is the DHP receptor that is mediating the coupling between the electrical phenomenon and mechanical phenomenon, finally releasing the coupler, that is calcium. But what is different is that in skeletal muscle, the ryanodine receptor is pulled open by a mechanical force, and so it is called electromechanical coupling. Whereas in the cardiac muscle, as we can see, it is not pulled open. Instead, it is stimulated by another chemical, which is calcium itself. So calcium causes calcium release. So it is a chemical that stimulates the release of other chemical. Incidentally, both are the same chemicals. So here it is known as electrochemical coupling. So because the electrical change in the membrane causes mechanical change in the dihydropyridine receptor in skeletal muscle, so skeletal muscle coupling is an electromechanical coupling. And because in the cardiac tissue, the electrical change in the membrane causes entry of a chemical, that is calcium, it is an electrochemical coupling. So the excitation-contraction coupling in the cardiac muscle, the way it differs from the skeletal muscle is that it is an electrochemical coupling and not electromechanical coupling. So I hope this part is clear to all of you. Now, when a muscle, heart muscle, is contracting, it's essentially generating cardiac output and also promoting the flow of blood. While the cardiac output is generated, there are many properties of the vasculature as well as the heart that determine how much of blood will go out of the heart. That is what will be the stroke volume or cardiac output. There are 2 or 3 parameters that we very commonly use in physiological and medical terminologies, like preload, afterload, and contractility. We must have a very clear and also mathematical idea about what is preload, what is afterload, and what is contractility. Look at this sling being pulled. So many of us have played with slings like this. Now, when you see this sling, when the small ball or bullet is pulled backward, the sling is getting stretched and it is storing a part of the kinetic energy in the form of elastic potential energy. When you are releasing the ball goes forward. The only force that is opposing the ball now is the resistance of the air. This previous stretching of the sling, similar to storing elastic potential energy. How much you stretch the string determines the force with which the ball goes out. This how much you stretch the sling is the preload. And after the ball has gone out of your sling, it's moving through the air, it's facing air resistance. This resistance is the afterload. So within physiological limits, preload facilitates the force of contraction, whereas afterload opposes the force of contraction. So this analogy of sling is, I think, very easy to understand the concept of preload and afterload. So if I define preload, preload is the stretch acting on the heart before it starts contracting, similar to pulling the sling. So what is stretching the heart before it is contracting? It's blood. So as much blood accumulates in the ventricle is the preload. So essentially, preload is the end diastolic volume, the amount of blood at the end of diastole. The end diastolic volume will be more if the venous return is more. So it is also equivalent to the venous return. The venous return will be more if the filling pressure is more. So it's also proportional to the filling pressure through the veins, also known as mean systemic filling pressure. So they are all equivalent terminologies of preload. Any of these physical quantities can be taken as an indicator of preload. The greater the value of this, within a limit, greater will be the force of contraction. Whereas, if we talk about afterload, afterload essentially is the resistance offered to the flowing blood. Now, as blood is flowing through the arteries and arterioles, it is the artery and arteriole that provide maximum resistance to the flowing blood. So it essentially refers to the total peripheral resistance, also known as the systemic peripheral resistance. Maximum resistance is offered by the arterioles, which are very narrow. Minimum resistance is offered by the capillaries. Although capillaries are even narrower, but they offer less resistance because you can understand from the anatomy of the capillaries that the capillaries are arranged in the form of a parallel circuit. And we know from the concept of fluid dynamics and electricity in physics that when a parallel circuit operates, the net resistance is less than the lowest resistance. So although they are the thinnest of the vessel, capillaries have very low resistance because of the parallel arrangement of the circuit. So arterioles are narrow as well as arranged in series. So arterioles contribute to the maximum total peripheral resistance. How does it then affect the blood flow? It definitely reduces the blood flow. So if we see graphically how preload and afterload will influence the cardiac output, then we can take the help of the Frank-Starling's principle. Frank-Starling's principle defines the relationship between preload and cardiac output. It says that greater the initial length of the myocardium, greater is the force of contraction. I'm repeating again. Greater the length of the myocardium means greater is the stretch, greater is the force of contraction. When you apply this law to the whole heart or whole ventricle, it can be modified as the stroke volume is proportional to the end diastolic volume. But this whole thing is happening within physiological limits. Beyond that, the law doesn't operate. So graphically, if you represent the Frank-Starling's law, you get a graph like this. And if you see this graph, you see very clearly that up to a certain point, that is from maybe here to here, it is almost a straight line. That means as the end diastolic volume increases, the stroke volume increases. After some time, it starts becoming parallel. And this is where the physiological limit has been reached. So even if you increase the end diastolic volume, the force of contraction does not increase because maximum overlap between actin myosin has already happened. It is now not possible to contract it further. So within the physiological limit, although it's not exactly a straight line, but it is almost a straight line. Also satisfying this equation that stroke volume is proportional to end diastolic volume. That is y is proportional to x, giving you a straight line obeying the formula y equal to mx. So this is the Frank-Starling's principle. In a similar way, we can also prove that the cardiac output or stroke volume is inversely related to the afterload. So if we graphically present these two, you see, as afterload increases, the stroke volume decreases. And as preload increases, the stroke volume up to a certain limit increases and then decreases. So within physiological limit, afterload decreases the cardiac output and preload increases the cardiac output. Is the concept of preload and afterload clear to everyone? Then I'll move on to the concept of contractility. Okay. Now the concept of contractility is very interesting and it's very mathematical. So see, we have already said that within physiological limits, the cardiac output or stroke volume, as you might say, is proportional to the preload. Assuming that afterload is constant. Similarly, within physiological limits, we have seen that cardiac output is inversely proportional to the afterload. Of course, when preload is constant. So, by using the theorem of joint variation, we can write that cardiac output may be also said to be proportional jointly to preload by afterload. And now bringing in a constant of equality, cardiac output will be equal to some constant into preload by afterload. It is this constant which is known as contractility. Which means mathematically, if P by A, that is preload and afterload, becomes constant, please do not annotate. Vinita Nikram, you are annotating. There is no need to annotate and scribble on the board. So this is known as contractility. So how is contractility going to be defined now? If I make P by A constant, then cardiac output will be proportional to, you can easily see this, contractility itself when P by A is constant. This is very similar to the concept of specific heat of metals and similar such constants which depend on the property of the material. So now based on this we can define contractility. So contractility is the intrinsic property of a heart or myocardium that determines the force of contraction or cardiac output. When preload and afterload are constant, which means irrespective of preload and afterload. Which means that contractility does not depend on preload and afterload. So what does it depend on? Cardiac output depends on preload and afterload, but not contractility. That's the intrinsic property of the heart. Even if same preload and afterload are given to the heart of three different people, they will not generate the same cardiac output because they have different contractility. One of the most important determinant of contractility is the cytosolic calcium ion concentration. Now, in the cardiac tissue, calcium ions enter under the influence of cyclic AMP. So, this depends on the cyclic AMP level. In the cardiac tissue, cyclic AMP level increases when beta adrenergic receptor is stimulated. So, it depends on stimulation of beta 1 receptor. And therefore, it also depends on autonomic or sympathetic innervation. Anything that increases the contractility is called positive ionotropic agent, and which decreases the contractility is the negative ionotropic agent. So contractility itself is called the ionotropic state of the heart. Keeping this in mind, you can easily find out which agents may be candidates of different kinds of a positive ionotropic agent. The beta 1 receptor agonists, for example, adrenaline, noradrenaline, or dopamine, they are all positive ionotropic agents. Agents that increase cyclic AMP level, like the phosphodiesterase inhibitors that prevent metabolism of phosphodiesterase, like enamrinone. milrinone. These drugs and also caffeine, they help in increasing cyclic AMP level, and therefore they also act as positive ionotropic agent. Or drugs that directly increase the calcium ion concentration in the heart, drugs like digoxin, the cardiac glycosides. You can also guess from this what are the negative ionotropic agents. Anything that will oppose the process. So anything that blocks the beta 1 receptor is a negative ionotropic agents. For example, beta blockers. Anything that decreases the calcium ion concentration is a negative ionotropic agent. For example, the calcium channel blockers. Now, potentially, if there is a drug that stimulates the cyclic AMP formation, the cyclic AMP breakdown, that is stimulators of phosphodiesterase, if there is a drug like this, then that will also be a negative ionotropic agent. Unfortunately, we don't have a clinically approved drug which is a cardiac phosphodiesterase stimulator, so that drug is not there. This was the hypothetical drug I was talking about. So if we discover a drug which stimulates phosphodiesterase in the cardiac cell, then that can act as a negative ionotropic agent by decreasing the cyclic AMP level. So is the concept of contractility clear to everyone? Great. We can now move on to the graphical annotation of the effect of contractility on the different curves of stroke volume versus preload or afterload. Now see, you have to understand how the Frank-Starling's law is going to affect this curve. The Frank-Starling's curve, as we have mathematically presented, simply represents that cardiac output or stroke volume must be equal to contractility multiplied by preload divided by afterload. That means that when you are plotting stroke volume with preload, you are essentially keeping the contractility as the slope of the curve. Because if you compare this equation with the standard mathematical form, that is y is equal to m into x, then here preload or P is your x. C by A becomes M and stroke volume becomes Y. And what is slope of a curve? Slope of a curve is the angle that this graph is, or the tangent to this graph is making with the x-axis. If that is true, then you see in this way, if I draw the slope at a point like this, then tangent of the angle theta to this point is the slope of the curve, and that is the contractility. Because the tangent function is an increasing function, it simply means that the higher up the curve goes, there will be more contractility, and the lower down the curve goes, there will be less contractility. Which means if I now try to increase the contractility of this heart, gradually the curves will start looking like this. And if I decrease the contractility of these curves, they will start looking like this. So a downward shift in the curve represents that this is a less contractility, and an upward shift of the curve represents there is greater contractility. This can also be proven in a very simple manner. You choose a series of Frank-Starling's curve as here and just drop a perpendicular from a point. Now what does this perpendicular represent? A particular value of preload. You see at this particular value of preload, there are different cardiac output or stroke volume that are available. S1, S2 is the next stroke volume, S3 is the next stroke volume, S4 is the next stroke volume, accordingly. which means at the same preload remaining constant, different hearts are having different stroke volume. That is the definition of contractility. Something that determines the stroke volume irrespective of the preload. So higher up the graph, higher is the contractility. Using the same logic in the afterload curve, you can see that as contractility increases, the graph starts getting shifted towards the right. As contractility decreases, the graph starts getting shifted towards the left. Now, if you ask me, how do you prove this? Even visually, this can be proven. Again here, to prove this point, you drop a perpendicular at any point. So the perpendicular represents a particular value of afterload. At the same value of afterload, you see this curve has the lowest stroke volume. This curve has a higher stroke volume. This curve has a still higher stroke volume. In this way, as you go from left to right, as you are moving from the left side to the right side, the contractility is increasing. So I hope you understand how graphically contractility can be represented. Although a very abstract concept, it can be represented by slope of the Frank-Starling's curve or by rightward or leftward shifting of the afterload versus stroke volume curve. This is a difficult concept, so it's good if you have understood this. I hope most of you have understood this. So again, you see here, as I was saying, the more you move downwards, it's decreased contractility, and the more you move upwards, it is increased contractility. This Frank-Starling curve is also sometimes called cardiac function curve. So moving on, try this question, which we tried before. Contractility of heart depends on. The answer will be C, autonomic innervation, because I already defined in the definition of contractility that contractility is a property irrespective of preload and afterload. Cardiac output depends on all of the above, but not contractility. Contractility is like specific heat of a metal that depends on electronic configuration. It does not depend on how much temperature that thing is getting heated up to. Similarly, preload and afterload are external variables, whereas autonomic innervation can modulate the calcium ion concentration by sympathetic innervation. Therefore, it influences the contractility of the heart. Excitation-contraction coupling in cardiac muscle is. Wonderful. It is electrochemical in nature. In this afterload versus stroke volume curve, which one has maximum contractility? Very good. The answer is C. In the preload versus stroke volume curve, which one represents maximum contractility? Wonderful. The answer is A. Finally, speak about the property of the drug X. Yes, this will be a negative ionotropic agent because it will decrease cyclic AMP concentration. Coming to the final section, the electrophysiological properties of the heart. Let us try these questions. The earliest event in generation of pacemaker potential is. Okay, the answers are all split in opinion. I'll move on to the next question. Look at this fast response action potential with the phases labeled. So if I add a sodium channel blocker, which phase of the action potential will be affected? Next question. This is the slow response action potential. The phase 4 of the pacemaker potential can be prolonged by which of the agents? Next question. Cardiac muscle cannot be titanized. What is the reason behind this? Now we come to the last question of today's episode, and this is also a question that many of the students confuse with this question. It is an entirely different question. Cardiac muscle do not get fatigued. What is the reason behind that? Okay. So we'll now enter the discussion on these questions and come back to these questions to see what we have answered. We know that the heart has a specialized tissue called the junctional tissue, and this is responsible for the electrical impulse generation and conduction. Autorhythmicity is a unique property of these tissue that they can generate their own impulse. Impulse generates in the SA node, travels down to the AV node through the internodal tracts. In the AV node, it waits for some time. From there, it enters the bundle of His and enters the ventricle. It then divides into left and right branches, and the left branch further divides into anterior and posterior fascicles. Finally, they all divide into Purkinje fibers and synapse with the individual cardiomyocytes. Now, uh, how does this autorhythmic potential generate? In heart, we have two types of action potential. The slow response action potential that has a slow slope, and a fast response action potential that has a fast slope. The pacemaker cells like SA node and AV node show the slow response action potential. And the contractile cells show the fast response action potential. We will now talk in detail about their ionic basis and how they contribute to the cardiac properties. Let us first talk about the slow response action potential. Heart is one of those rare tissues that can generate its own impulse. And generation of its own impulse is because of a property known as pacemaker potential. So what happens during this pacemaker potential? We know that during the repolarization phase, potassium ions were going out. As potassium ions were going out, the cell was becoming more and more negative. Towards the beginning of the next action potential, there is slowing down of the potassium efflux. So the first event that happens is that the potassium efflux becomes more and more slow. So positive charge increases in the cell and it starts becoming positive. The second phenomenon that happens here is that during this negative state or hyperpolarized state, a very peculiar cation channel gets activated. This cation channel causes entry of sodium and potassium, making the cell more positive. Because it is probably the only cation channel that is activated during hyperpolarization, it is also known as the funny current or the hyperpolarization current. Once the potential has moved a bit up, the third thing and the final thing that pushes it up to the threshold level is the entry of calcium ion, which happens through the T-type calcium channels. So the three events that make up the pacemaker potential, also known as diastolic depolarization, is number one, a decrease or decay in potassium efflux. Second, there is opening of funny current. And third, there is entry of calcium through T-type calcium channel. These three things in sequence push the membrane potential to the threshold level. Once the threshold has been reached, a second kind of calcium channel opens up, known as the L-type calcium channels, or the long-lasting type. So the upslope after the threshold is caused by the L-type calcium channel. After reaching the peak, there is activation of the outward potassium channel and potassium starts to go out. It is the same potassium current which will decrease at the beginning of the next cardiac potential. So the downslope is due to efflux of potassium. So this is the basis of the cardiac slow action potential, and the autorhythmicity is because of the pacemaker potential. Out of all these, the most important probably is the opening of the funny current, because that is the unique current that operates during hyperpolarization, generating the autorhythmicity. There are many factors that can influence the hyperpolarization current. This hyperpolarization current can be stimulated by many agents, and two important agents that can stimulate it are hyperpolarization and cyclic AMP. So anything that increases cyclic AMP or hyperpolarizes the cell can cause opening of the funny current. Although the funny current is a sodium current and potassium current, conventional sodium-potassium channel blockers cannot block this current. So sodium channel blockers have no effect on the slow action potential. Instead, if we block the calcium channel, there will be a tendency for calcium not to enter, and so there will be delay in the pacemaker potential. Since potassium channel is going out, so blocking the potassium current only makes the action potential faster. It is opening the potassium channel that will make it slower. So I hope this is clear to everyone. We move on to the discussion of the fast cardiac action potential. This is the fast cardiac action potential, and we all know that the fast action potential is caused by different ionic activities. One stimulate, there is no pacemaker potential. It has to be stimulated by the junctional tissue. Phase 0 is due to explosive entry of sodium, and this can be blocked by sodium channel blockers, making the slope much more less steep and slow. From stage 1 onwards, there is efflux of potassium throughout. So potassium starts to go out through different types of potassium channels. The initial efflux of potassium brings down the action potential and is known as the brief repolarization or early repolarization. Then simultaneous with potassium, we see that there is entry of calcium. This entry of calcium and the exit of potassium maintains the plateau phase. Also remember, this is this calcium that will ultimately cause contraction. And then the calcium current stops in a time dependent manner and the potassium continues to go out, bringing down the action potential to phase 4, and this cycle will repeat itself. So obviously phase 0 can be affected by the sodium channel blockers. Phase 1, 2, 3 can be all affected by potassium channel blockers. particularly phase 3, which is based only on the potassium current. The plateau phase can be blocked by calcium channel blockers. And because beta adrenergic receptor has two important effects. Beta adrenergic receptors cause calcium entry and also increase in cyclic AMP. So beta blockers can affect the plateau phase as well as the funny current in the slow action potential that depends on cyclic AMP. This is how different drugs affect the cardiac action potential. Sympathetic stimulation makes the action potential faster. Parasympathetic or cholinergic stimulation or vagal stimulation makes it slower. The mechanisms are very predictable. For example, as there is sympathetic stimulation, there is increased cyclic AMP. Increase in cyclic AMP will stimulate the funny current, so the heart rate becomes more and more rapid. Stimulation with acetylcholine causes opening of a potassium channel that hyperpolarizes the cell. Also, the cyclic AMP level is reduced by acetylcholine. All these things dampen the funny current and therefore there will be slowing of the heart rate. So I hope that these properties were well understood. We now move on to the question why cardiac muscle cannot be titanized. Titanization means summation of contraction to the level where there is a permanent contraction. So tetany will occur when the impulse comes during the contraction of one muscle. Now, because the heart has a pretty long refractory period, during the contraction phase, the absolute refractory period is still there. So the second impulse cannot stimulate the heart. And since the stimulus cannot come during the contraction phase, titanization is not possible. So the reason why cardiac muscle cannot be titanized is the prolonged refractory period of heart. On the other hand, when we refer to the word fatigue, fatigue means that the muscle now becomes painful and weak. When you exercise for a long time, you will see that the muscles have become painful and the performance decreases. Fatigue happens due to many reasons in skeletal muscle. In skeletal muscle, fatigue is due to exhaustion of ATP, reduced oxygen supply, and most importantly, accumulation of lactate that causes the early soreness in the muscle. Now, there are certain advantages that the cardiac tissue has, which prevents the development of fatigue. In the cardiac tissue, there is more number of mitochondria compared to skeletal muscle. As a result, ATP generation is not a problem for the healthy cardiac tissue. The heart has a very rich coronary vasculature. So blood supply or supply of oxygen is also not a problem. But most uniquely, this has been recently discovered that the LDH isoenzyme that heart has a unique property. It can very rapidly convert lactate into pyruvate. So lactate does not accumulate in the heart. Although it can form in the heart, but it does not accumulate. For this reason, the cardiac muscle does not get fatigued. So up to this, is this clear to everyone? Okay. So for your further readings, you can read different books. Before that, let us see if our answers were correct. So what is the earliest event in pacemaker potential generation? Wonderful. It is the reduced potassium efflux or potassium decay. A sodium channel blocker will affect which phase of this action potential? Wonderful. The phase 0. Phase 4 of pacemaker potential can be prolonged by what? Wonderful. The answer will be C, calcium channel blocker. Because although potassium and sodium enters through the funny current, but the potassium and sodium channel blockers cannot block the funny current. Cardiac muscle cannot be titannized because of. Very good. Long refractory period. And finally, cardiac muscle do not get fatigued because of. Very good. Due to the unique isoenzyme of lactate dehydrogenase that converts this rapidly into pyruvate. So I think these were a few of the basics that we needed to get clear before starting the clinical topics like cardiac failure and ECG. These are few of the books that if you wish you can read. They are wonderful resources to understand cardiovascular properties, and that was the presentation pretty much. So Vishnu, this was my presentation. It's over to you now.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable time and really, really an amazing session. I request you guys, please, if you have any of the questions, you can post it on the chat box.
There are a few questions coming up. I'll try to answer one or two of them before the time is over. Uh, so there's one question about the drug X. The drug X in the question was a phosphodiesterase stimulator. So it will rapidly metabolize cyclic AMP. If cyclic AMP decreases, then calcium decreases, then contractility decreases. So it will be a negative ionotropic agent. Manisha, your question is if acetylcholine opens potassium channel, there is hyperpolarization. Should that also activate the HCN channels? Yes, the acetylcholine sensitive potassium channel do cause hyperpolarization, but understand one thing, hyperpolarization stimulates the funny current. The funny current overruns the hyperpolarization and reaches the threshold potential. But here you are using a pharmacological agent which is constantly opening up the potassium channel. As it is constantly open, the overrunning of this potential by the funny current will not be possible. And this defines the effective dose of acetylcholine. So below that, of course, it can be overcome with the HCN channels or the funny channels. But beyond that particular dose, when excess acetylcholine is present, that cannot be overrun by the funny current, and therefore the cell will become more silent. Okay, thank you very much. So stay tuned for the next episode. The next episode will be tomorrow, and we'll be discussing the clinical and basic sciences related to cardiac failure. Vishnu, you can take over now and conclude.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. Looking forward for your tomorrow's participation. If you guys have any question, you can WhatsApp me. I can ask. I can let you know, or I can post the answer on the group. So please, guys, not leave the group, as we will be sending you the links and certificate forms over there. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you, sir.